After graduation, I decided to rent my own housing and move out of my mother's apartment. Fortunately, I had enough money as I worked as a watchman consultant in an organization dealing with all sorts of stone stuff. That period of my life deserves a separate story. I looked for options, checked a few apartments, and chose an old one-room flat in the city center, half an hour's walk from the apartment I used to live in. Firstly, the price was fine with me, and secondly, the apartment was in fairly good condition. The old woman Margaret, who was the owner, even put cable TV and internet there. Of course, there was no computer and TV, but I took mine from home. Life seemed to be getting better. I took my dog, Max, from home. Sometimes I invited my girlfriend Grace, and we had fabulous evenings there. Then, we finally moved in together. I didn't notice any oddities, except that my dog whined in the evenings and, in general, was restless. I still attribute it to the fact that he just missed my mother. After all, the animal loves the owner. He used to run around the flat, but after midnight, he calmed down and went to sleep next to our bed. It all started exactly from the day when my mother asked me to bring Max home. She said that she was bored staying home alone, and the dog, as I have already mentioned, missed her too. That wasn't a big problem for me. After work, I visited my mom, walked the dog, and then walked slowly to my apartment. The road past the park, the evening coolness, a young lady in a dressing gown waiting for dinner in the apartment. Isn't it a dream? When I came home, I found my lady tearful and pale. As soon as she understood that I was standing in the hallway, she immediately rushed to hug me. She kissed me and cried. Of course, it made me wary. "What's wrong, honey?" I asked.
"Oh dear, they were shouting so loud. I can't stand it. They fight, argue, and run around the staircase. And he was banging on our door, shouting, 'Open it, bitch, or I'll knock it down.'"
My girl began to sob. "Wait, I don't understand. Who was shouting? Who was running?" I asked in disbelief.
"Neighbors,"
Grace drawled despite her sobs. Without thinking twice, I armed myself with a baton, which I still keep at the door just in case, and went to the neighbors. There were 4 apartments in the staircase. Fortunately, there was only one common wall, and Grace claimed that it was behind the wall that people were quarreling and fighting, and it was their wooden door that slammed when they ran up the stairs. Wooden doors were only in our apartment and in the next one. The other 2 were iron. In a moment, I was standing at the neighbor's door, clutching the baton in my hand. The door wasn't upholstered, only covered with peeling brown paint. 2 ancient locks embedded in the door, and a worn iron handle made me think that it was a door to some kind of shed, but not an apartment. "Greetings from alcoholics," I thought. With a mirthless smile, I pressed the bell button. When I didn't hear any sounds outside the door, I knocked on it with a fist. Grace's sobs and sniffling could be heard from behind our door, and my gut filled with even greater hatred for negligent neighbors. I knocked on the door even more insistently, this time with my foot. Still, there was no answer. Having cursed the ill-fated apartment, I rang the doorbell of the next apartment. The door was opened by a young woman of about 30, whose name was Rose. Rose was divorced and lived with her young son. When we moved in, she came to visit us consistently once a week. She was about to start arguing, but when she understood that it was me, she smiled.
"Oh, it's you. I thought it would be one of those."
The woman nodded cautiously in the direction of the brown door.
"Someone is breaking in to visit, as usual. Come in, you are always welcome." and call Grace. Let's have some tea."
Having settled down in Rose's kitchen, we started talking, cursing the bad apartment and its inhabitants. Rose told me that she also sometimes hears some scuffing going on behind the wall, shouts, and swearing, and in the morning, the light is always on there. By the way, the dirty, broken windows of that apartment face the yard, and one of them, completely broken, was covered from the inside with a soiled baby blanket. In general, the picture is unpleasant. After talking like this for about 2 hours, we dropped the accumulated negativity a little. The only thing that was alarming, neither we nor Rose could remember the appearance of the tenants of the apartment behind the brown door. Rose said that a married couple lives there, chronic severe alcoholics. If it is quiet, then they either leave the apartment or the binge ends. But when they start drinking, that's when the disaster comes. The man, according to a neighbor, was seen only by her son. He saw a strange man in the window when he was playing in the yard. The boy said that scary uncle was watching them and then hid. After that, we said goodbye to Rose and went to get ready for sleep. It turned into a routine, consistently, once or twice a month. The farce with a knock on our door was repeated, but only when I wasn't home. I came home. Grace was sobbing and shaking. Every time I tried to reach the neighbors, the result was always the same. One day, I came up with an idea. I took a day off from work, but in the evening, I still went out as if to work. Then, I sneaked into our apartment, sat down at the door, and started to wait. I sat for a long time, but nothing happened. Then I decided to go to bed. We lay with Grace, chatted, discussed social mores, and especially the drunk morons next door. It was about 11 p.m. when voices began to be heard behind the wall, male and female. Usually, you can hear everything perfectly in old houses, but the owner of our flat just hung a carpet on that wall. And, by the way, a wooden cross, so we couldn't make out the words. But obviously, a scandal was about to break out. He yelled something, shouted at a woman. She talked back, and even threw some heavy objects. We could hear something falling with a thud on the floor and rolling. Perhaps she threw a saucepan at that drunk fool. It happens. I spent my childhood with similar neighbors, a schizophrenic teacher on top, a moonshiner on the right, and drug addicts on the left. It was some kind of nostalgia. I was lying with Grace, listening to all that noise. She was afraid, so she instinctively grabbed my arm and held it tight. We heard the door opening in the next apartment, and then footsteps on the staircase. Slap, slap. It seemed like someone was running with bare feet. Then other steps, someone bigger and heavier. So the woman ran away from the man, and he was still trying to catch her. Heavy footsteps retreated somewhere up the stairs, then down. Then I distinctly felt that he stopped at our door. It seemed like I could hear him breathing. The silence was so thick. And then Grace whispered,
"I'm scared."
But this whisper sounded somehow unbearably loud in the silence that was surrounding us. Almost immediately after those words, he began pounding on the door with his fist and feet, or maybe the man hit with his whole body. He shouted,
"Come out, bitch! I'll f*** you up! You thought you would hide from me? Then I'll burn you alive there! Do you hear me?"
My heart was pounding, but I got up and pulled on my trousers. The fear of the idiot behind the door was nothing compared to the desire to protect my happy everyday life. I grabbed my trusty baton and shoved my bare feet into my sneakers. My hand reached the lock, but then I heard the door of the neighboring apartment slam shut. After looking through the peephole, I didn't see anyone outside the door. I decided not to take off my sneakers and trousers, called Grace, and we sat down at the table in the kitchen, putting the kettle on the fire. Dishes were breaking behind the wall. Something heavy was falling. The man smashed furniture and other objects that came to hand. Grace and I nervously drank tea and silently listened to the farce that was going on. The neighbor's door slammed again, but more quietly. Apparently, the wife of the drunk has returned. Here we go again. The noise we heard this time still makes my blood run cold when I think about it. Almost immediately, a woman's scream pierced the silence, in which there was such pain and horror that it seemed that the eardrums were ready to burst voluntarily, just not to hear these sounds. It was as if not a woman was screaming, but a circular saw was working, cutting live pigs. The scream subsided only for a second, only to return with even more creepy sticky notes. Grace dropped the cup, and it shattered into dozens of pieces, showering my feet with hot tea. I put my cup on the table, otherwise it would certainly have repeated the fate of Grace's one, because my hands were shaking as they had never shaken in my life. It was an extreme situation, and I had to do at least something. I took my mobile phone and dialed the police. The sluggish voice of the deputy officer sounded like an angel singing among all the sound horror that surrounded us.
911, how can I help you?
Come quickly. A woman is being killed here. Address, 46 Park Avenue.
The patrol has already been sent 10 minutes ago. Stop calling.
The officer blurted out irritably and hung up the phone. The screams gradually subsided, turning into periodic sobs. Grace, having climbed into bed and covered her head with a pillow, echoed the sounds from the neighbor's apartment. The doorbell rang. They didn't knock, but they rang the bell. I heard the bell of Rose's apartment and the clang of the iron door. The police arrived. With relief, I went out to the stairwell, where people in uniform were crowding. Some of them were ordinary police officers, and the other 3 hefty guys were from the special force. Maybe it was SWAT or something. I'm not good at that stuff. With machine guns and a sledgehammer. Rose called the police to our address before me. A mustachioed police officer asked us about the neighbors from this apartment and who of us called the police, scribbled something in a notebook, and knocked on the ill-fated brown door. As I expected, there was no response. The policeman loudly warned me that they would break down the door if the owners didn't open it. No reaction.
Break it.
The mustachioed man ordered, and one of the SWAT team members slammed a sledgehammer on the door. The lock shattered, and the door, slowly opening, crawled towards us. The guy with the sledgehammer opened the door and stood behind it, looking puzzled at his colleagues, who, instead of breaking into the apartment, stood rooted to the spot. I pinched my side. No, it was clearly not a dream. Behind the door, the passage was bricked up. It was so tightly laid, only at the top, there was a black gap about 2 inches wide. The officers exchanged glances, and then glared at me and Rose angrily. We had nothing to say, and the lieutenant, twirling his fingers at his temple, was already turning around and walking down the stairs when a distinct stifled sob was heard from the apartment. We all turned to the brickwork at once. The lieutenant turned pale and gave the order to break the masonry. A guy with a sledgehammer persistently pounded bricks for 10 minutes. Sleepy, angry neighbors came to the sound, demanding that the noise be stopped immediately. Most of the tenants present at the entrance were my age, or slightly older, and they couldn't say anything about the inhabitants of the apartment. The lieutenant quickly asked me, Rose, Grace, who had floated out of our apartment, and 3 other guys to be witnesses, and the SWAT officers, pointing flashlights into the darkness reigning behind the door, disappeared into the doorway, moving the broken bricks with their combat boots. Behind them, clutching a service Glock in his hand, the lieutenant stepped into the darkness. 2 sullen deputy officers stayed with us. The sounds of footsteps and the clatter of special forces equipment could be heard from the apartment. The rays of flashlights flashed in the doorway. picking out bizarre silhouettes from the darkness. A loud
All clear.
was heard, and one by one, the tall Special Forces soldiers and then the mustachioed lieutenant came out of the door. His shirt was smeared with something black.
Do you have a flashlight?
The mustachioed policeman asked me. I nodded and brought my powerful camping flashlight and also took large circular lighting with a built-in radio. We entered the door with the policeman, the witness, and one SWAT soldier.
Be careful. Watch your step.
The lieutenant warned, and I followed his advice. There were burnt floorboards under my feet, some fragments of furniture, and crooked rusty nails. I looked around. The walls were all covered in soot. Only fragments of ancient wallpaper with stupid flowers remained under the ceiling. My heart was pounding anxiously, and I put my free arm around Grace, who was walking next to me. She was nervously gnawing a nail, looking around with wide open eyes.
Now, someone explain to me,
The lieutenant said, turning to face us.
what the hell is going on here?
Naturally, we couldn't explain anything. The officers let us go to our apartments, having previously collected data and sealed the apartment with a brown door. The next morning, I called the old lady from whom I rented the apartment. She agreed to come and tell us everything she knew. We gathered in our kitchen, me, Grace, Rose, and her son, the guys who were recorded as witnesses, our district police officer, and a lanky investigator who was assigned to conduct the case. Everyone was waiting for the owner of our apartment. She arrived much later than promised. She sat down at the table and dripped a few drops of medicine. The policemen were nervously sorting through the papers. Rose and her son went to the hall to play. The old lady began her story. I will omit unnecessary details of family life and the origin of her family. I will only mention what is connected with the apartment. In general, her sister and her sister's husband lived in that apartment. The husband worked at the factory, and she drove a tram. Once, the husband was injured in the foundry. His face and hand were burned, and only one eye remained. The arm was also amputated. Medicine did everything it could at that time, but the young man was crippled for life. And obviously, he went nuts. He began to drink, beat his wife because she was a beauty, and he turned into a monster. She loved him, no matter what, and felt sorry for him. When he beat her, she used to run out of the apartment, but she always came back. And then one day, when he was really raging, the unfortunate girl ran away from home and hid until the morning with her sister, that is, in our apartment. Until dawn, the husband threw plates, broke furniture, knocked on the door of our apartment, but she didn't open it and also ordered her sister to stay quiet. In the morning, Margaret went to work and her sister returned to her husband. When Margaret came home for lunch, she saw a fire truck, an ambulance, and police near the entrance. It turned out that the brother-in-law first tortured his wife, cut her face and chest with a knife, and then tied her to a radiator and set fire to the apartment. Both spouses were dead. After that incident, an old brown door, donated by one of the neighbors, was put on the apartment. Soon, the tenants in the stairwell began to complain that, at night, it rattled and slammed because of the draft. After that, the residents put the glass in the broken windows, and to the one window frame they nailed the baby blanket I've mentioned before. The passage was laid with brick so as not to make drafts and not to smell the burning. No one has entered the apartment for 20 years, and listening to the woman's story, the young district police officer laughed, and the investigator, with a deliberately serious look, said,
We'll figure it out.
I escorted the law enforcement officers to the door, and all our guests left, except Margaret, who was sitting in the kitchen. I closed the door and heard her quietly saying to someone,
Don't worry. Hush, hush. It's all over. Soon I will come to you.
The old lady noticed me and smiled sadly.
If you move out this month, I won't take any payment.
she said to us at parting, and hobbled to the bus stop. When I returned to the apartment, I noticed elongated black spots on the carpet in the corridor. I looked closer and realized that these were bare footprints. I felt sick. The next day, we moved out of that apartment, and my colleague from my previous job moved in almost immediately. Then, he told me that he also heard sobs outside the door in the stairwell, and behind the wall, there were rustles, blows, and dissatisfied grumbling. Only when he was informed about the death of Margaret, the sobbing stopped, as well as extraneous sounds behind the wall. Later, that apartment with a brown door was bought for some kind of office,